Months ago, I was listening to an interview with Tony Robbins, who said that if he could recommend any book to read, he would recommend a book published in 1991 called Generations: The History of America's Future. Because it was Tony Robbins and I treat everything he says as gold, I had to read it. In it, the authors William Strauss and Neil Howe argue that there are themes in the past which we can use to make predictions about the course of the future. As skeptical as I was at first, the more I read, the more it seemed to make sense to me. Many might say that the authors are trying to determine the future of millions of people who have yet to be born, but that really isn't what they're talking about. Their book takes a broad look at the generations of people over the past 500 years of US history and has found recurring themes in the personality of each generation and how generations follow repeating patterns. They found that there are 4 recurring types of generations, that each generation lasts on average 22 years, and that the 4 types of generations arrive in the same repeating sequence. By understanding this, we can potentially predict the characteristics of the next generation of people along with probable reactions that generations may have to certain historical events. The authors make no claim that the future can be determined, but instead state that it is history that makes the generation while simultaneously the generation making history. The first important thing to understand in Howe's and Strauss's theory is what they mean by generation. A generation is a cohort of people who have been born over the same time span of around 22 years, or about the length of one phase of life, like the length of childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and old age. Members of a generation share 3 things in common. Number 1, they have been born during the same time in history. In other words, they have encountered the same key historical events. As a millennial, for example, I witnessed 9/11 during roughly the same time period in my life as all other millennials, that is childhood. And because people are shaped by the events they encounter, this leads us to number 2, how they adapt similar beliefs and behaviors. As a reaction to the strong anti-Islamic sentiments after the 9/11 attacks, many of us millennials have reacted in the opposite way as our parents and country's leaders, showing strong disapproval of generalized anti-Muslim sentiment and instead a more optimistic and open view of Muslims and other cultures in general. And because of each generation's awareness of the traits they share with their peers, they, number 3, have a sense of common perceived membership in that generation. Of course, as a millennial, I feel more part of the millennial generation than any other generation. The most recent generations have been the baby boomers, which began in 1943 and ended in 1960, lasting 23 years. During their formative years, some key historical events that the boomers have encountered is the end of World War II and the beginning of the countercultural movement. After the boomers are the Gen Xers, who are made up of people who are born from 1961 to 1981. After the Gen Xers are the millennials, born from 1982 to 2004, and most recently the Homeland generation, born from 2005 and on. What's most interesting about the idea about generations of people is that it's not a new one. In fact, some of the past's greatest thinkers have outlined the idea of a generation in a similar way as Strauss and Howe. Some include Polybius Ibn Khaldun and Jose Ortega y Gasset. The American philosopher Louis Mumford also once said that each generation revolts against its fathers and makes friends with its grandfathers. Which leads us to the next key idea, turnings. As mentioned before, each generation lasts around 22 years and goes through particular historical and social events together. These events are called turnings, and just as generations last around 22 years, so do turnings. Turnings happen in a 4-stage consecutive cycle, and each has been given a particular name. Howe's and Strauss's have detailed them in US history from 1435 to the present day. A full cycle of the 4 turnings lasts between 80 and 90 years. An easier way to think about a turning is to think of it as kind of like a historical mood or season. According to the author, there are 4 major turnings or seasons that have occurred during each generational shift. The first turning is called high and is a post-crisis era when institutions are strong and individualism weak. The last high turning was after World War II up until JFK's assassination. During this time, the baby boomers were being born while the members of the GI generation were entering midlife, constructing a secure and conforming society. The next turning is called awakening. This is when institutions are attacked in the name of individualism. After the last high turning, an awakening occurred during the countercultural movement between the mid-1960s, and it eventually ended during the tax revolts of the 1980s. This was led by the baby boomers who were entering young adulthood while rebelling against their parents' conforming institutions. The third turning is called unraveling. This is the opposite of the high turning and is when society indulges and breaks apart. The most recent unraveling was between the mid-1980s and the early 2000s during the long boom of economic growth and the culture wars between US progressives and conservatives. During this time, the Gen Xers were coming of age as the millennials were being born. The last turning is called crises, and this is when institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to some kind of threat to the nation's survival. The most recent full completion of a crises turning began after the 1929 Wall Street crash and ended with the end of World War II. Based on the author's predictions in 1991, society is currently in the middle of a crisis turning right now. Each of these turnings lasts roughly the length of one life stage of a generation, from 20 to 22 years. The combination of the 4 turnings is called a seculum and happen every 80 to 90 years, or about the length of a long human life. The authors say that there is a symbiotic relationship between generations and turnings. As generations age into their next life phase, society's moods and behaviors changes as well, giving rise to a new turning. It's as if historical events shape generations in childhood and young adulthood, and then, as the members of a generation come of age and become leaders in midlife and old age, they in turn shape history. The authors have identified that 7 complete seculum turnings have occurred throughout US history dating back to 1435, but that's not the only repeating pattern they found. Along with turnings, another important idea in their theory is the idea of generational archetypes. According to Strauss and Howe, each generation has a particular archetype. These archetypes repeat sequentially and in rhythm with the specific turnings of crises and awakenings, meaning one generational archetype comes around once every 80 to 90 years. Generational archetypes share some of the most basic beliefs about family, culture, values, and civic engagement. In other words, generations shaped by similar historical events in their childhood develop similar collective generational characteristics in later life. The 4 generational archetypes are prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. Prophets are a generation born near the end of a crisis during a time of rejuvenated community and consensus around a new societal order. They grow up as indulged children during a post-crisis era and come of age as self-involved crusaders of an awakening. As they come of age, their values turn toward morals and principles, and they enter into old age guiding a new crisis. The most recent example would be the baby boomer generation born after World War II, leading the countercultural movement and then guiding society on how to deal with the current crises that surround us, such as climate change, the war on terror, ISIS, etc. The next generation in line is the nomad generation, which are people born during an awakening. The most recent example would be the Gen X generation born during the countercultural movement. Nomads grow up as underprotected children and come of age as alienated adults. Because nomads are left to their own from a young age, many grow up fast and engage in risky behavior. While often cynical, nomads are left with strong survival skills and are well suited to survive the societal unraveling that surrounds them. The next generation is the hero generation, which are people born after an awakening and during an unraveling when society is more individualistic and indulgent. Heroes grow up as overprotected children and come of age as young optimists during a crisis. They enter adulthood as energetic and overconfident adults and age into politically powerful elders that are attacked by another awakening. The current generation of millennials are a hero generation. Today's millennials have come of age during the US's war on terror, the Great Recession, and climate change. The heroes before the millennials were the GI generation, who were born between 1901 and 1924 and came of age during World War II, and whose values were attacked during the countercultural movement of the 60s and 70s. Final generational archetype is the artist. These are those born during a crisis when children are expected to behave and stay out of the way as the adults are preoccupied with the crisis. Artists are taught from a young age to please adults and thus become one of the most well-off generations. The current generation of artists are called the Homeland generation and began in 2005 during the midst of the Great Recession and War on Terror. While Strauss and Howe explain and argue that this generational cycle is rhythmic, they also say it's not exact and is more like organic material. We, in other words, have a sense of its general principles, but we cannot predict precise changes. Instead, they use the metaphor of seasons, where seasons always occur in the same order but vary in their timing. Just as winter comes sooner or later and might be severe or mild, the same is true of any turning in any given seculum. After reading the book, I inevitably thought about the current crises that we are in today and about all of the crises that have been talked about over the past 10 years, the war on terror, climate change, ISIS, financial collapse, etc. It's impressive that the authors of this book were able to use their theory of generational history in 1991 to somewhat predict the societal climate of today, along with the optimism and civic engagement of the millennial generation. Strauss and Howe say that the beginning and or ending of any turning is not predictable, and just as Pearl Harbor and 9/11 came as a surprise, so too will the next turning. They do say, however, that their theory can help us approximate how each generational archetype will react to key historical events, thus shaping them. So far, they've been spot on. The question is, though, will their theory hold up over the next seculum? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button below and subscribe to Thought Monkey to stay updated for more videos.